So hi, today I want to talk a little bit about trauma. Trauma is one of those things that I think we oftentimes think is just the big thing that happens, as I say, the bear chasing you in the woods. But trauma can also be not only the big explosive things that are scary, but it can also be comprised of some small things that happen, or we call them small, that happen over a period of time. Maybe, for instance, growing up in a household where you weren't really sure if one of your caretakers were really going to take care of you. And then day after day of those things happening when it was very inconsistent, you still found yourself as an adult, and maybe you're in the middle of a breakup in a relationship, and not only are you the normal amount of sad or scared, but suddenly you feel this sensation of like, oh my gosh, how am I going to be taken care of? Maybe those rational words don't happen, but we can have a trauma response to not only the big things that happen, but also these things that we think of as smaller, but they can still create the same kind of reaction in our brains. And so I just want us to understand a little bit about what's happening with trauma, because when we do, we go to this, when we are experiencing trauma or being triggered from a past trauma, we go to this limbic part of our brain. And the limbic area of our brain is where we go into fight, flight, or freeze, and we react. And we're not thinking, and we're just reacting. And then later on, we can kind of go, oh, I wish I'd made a different decision. What I want to do is I want to show you a little bit of a sculpt of the brain, a very simple sculpt, not necessarily a simple brain, but a simple sculpt, just to show you a little bit about what happens so we can understand. So when people around you, if you've not been impacted by trauma, you maybe begin to understand why it looks like they're overreacting sometimes. Or why sometimes I think, especially in church environments, where there's a place where we'll go, just stop doing that thing, whatever it is you're doing. Surely you can just change your behavior. But not maybe understanding that if there's been trauma that's involved, the person may be reacting once they get to that limbic part of their brain, and the rational part is really not involved until they can kind of get grounded again. And we oftentimes don't understand that, and we completely misunderstand that think a person just doesn't care, when actually there's got some trauma that they've got to get healed so they can get out of that fight, flight, or freeze part of their brain. So what we have here, though it may not look like it, is a brain. We're going to pretend that this part of the brain is that limbic part of the brain. The part of the brain that does react. They go into fight, flight, or freeze. We can also say this part of the brain is like the smoke detector. It's going to let us know if there's a problem. And we're going to know really big, so I want to give her a prop. Yeah, a little bicycle horn. So give that thing a squeeze. Oh yeah, wow. So that'll, of course, terrify you two guys. It's great that you're sitting in front of her now, right?
Very loud.
So this is part of what the limbic brain does, though. It's going to let us know if there's an emergency, if there's something we got to pay attention to. And so she's going to represent that. So you ought to understand this part of the brain then is about survival. This part of the brain doesn't do the rational thinking. This part of the brain doesn't really get involved in agreements that you've made, or even in a marriage, in a relationship, where it's like, no, what's the right thing to do? This part of the brain isn't involved in morality, like, oh no, I know the right thing to do in this situation. This part of the brain's all about survival. And if you were to be walking out on a cold winter day and you're way out in, I don't know, North Dakota, someplace where you're miles away from anybody and it's 0 or below, you may finally come stumbling down beside of a tree, freezing to death. And this part of the brain is actually a part that actually starts even shutting down some of the parts of your body, like organs in your body, going, we don't need that right now. We need the warm blood to survive. And so this is a part of what helps to take over. This isn't the part we think about. This is a part of what reacts to help us stay alive. And so that's at least one of this part of our brain's functions. Now, we come over here, and this brain is facing this way. So this is the left prefrontal cortex. is the other part that we're going to have here, the prefrontal cortex. On the left side, this is where we do a lot of there's actually this little area called the Broca's area where we have language. We produce language. And so this is a part of our brain that helps speak to us. It produces speech. This is also the part of the brain that makes meaning out of things. You maybe have had one of those experiences and then later on you kind of go, oh, that's what that was about. This is where we do that. But this is also a place where we understand time and sequence. We realize that, oh yeah, that was 20 years ago. This is today. I'm thinking about something that's hopefully going to happen tomorrow. And we can understand sequence and make sense of that. This is also where we problem solve. We think rationally. And so this is the part of our brain that's really, we like to think is in control. Because we like to think we do things that are rational. The truth is, I've heard it, I have read that actually this part of our brain actually really makes more like 7 to 10% of our decisions because these guys are so much more involved than we would like to think. So we're going to give this guy the steering wheel because he's the rational one. We like to think he's in charge. However, as we come over to our other side, this guy is really all the right part of the brain. And in the right part of the brain, we do have emotions. We've got emotions back here too, but this side is much more emotional than that side. But over here, there is no sense of time as far as sequence. Let me tell you what I mean. You may have had the experience of driving in a car, and you're going down, you listen to the radio, or you're listening to your playlist, and the song comes on from years ago. And when that song comes on, maybe you don't just go, oh, yeah, I remember that song. It's sometimes there is this thing where you viscerally feel it. You suddenly, it feels in your body. You feel as if you're back in that day when you were listening to that song maybe 20 years ago. You can almost smell what you smelled in the room and all of those kinds of things. That's an example of this part of the brain just kind of being flooded with, oh, yeah, and it feels as if it's now, even though this part of the brain over there knows, no, that's not. But this part is like that, understand that feeling that it is. This part of the brain also processes images. We see and think things spatially. And so this is that right brain. We oftentimes think about if a person is right brain, they're more artistic because they spend a lot of time here. And so since he has a lot to do with images and spatial stuff, I saved this for you. It's a child, so it might be a little small, but at least for a moment you get to get the look of like, yeah, that's a good look. Now if it starts falling off, you can stick it up on top of your head or something. But so this gives us the sense of what our brain is doing with these props that they've got. And so let's just give an example of a normal everyday example that this I love it. This brain decides to get in the car and leave here, and this brain realizes it's hungry. Now, the first thing that happens is just give that a little squeeze. Okay. Brain realizes, oh, hunger. Now, first of all, it's got to figure out, is this life-threatening hunger, or is it just, I'm hungry? So it realizes, nope, not life-threatening. She goes through, this part of the brain goes through parts, some of the filters. And in that limbic part of the brain, there's several different filters it's going to go through to make that decision. But just to keep it simple, she's realizing, nope, it's not life-threatening. So, since it's just hunger, but you're pretty hungry, I want you to imagine what's one of the best things you've ever eaten and where it was. One of your favorite times that maybe you went to a restaurant and this was like just a really good experience. What's one of those that you remember having a great, and it's maybe one of your favorite foods?
Street tacos.
Street tacos, and where was it?
I think it was in New York.
Okay. Yeah. Can you kind of see the place?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So street tacos in New York City, right?
Yeah,
downtown.
Yeah.
He sees the place.
Yeah.
And now we're in Franklin, Tennessee, and near Nashville. You're in your car driving, right? You got the steering wheel. So for lunch, now that you're hungry, are you going to drive to New York to find this street taco place, see if you can find a place to park, just for lunch. No, we ain't doing that. So what are you going to likely do?
Maybe get tacos.
And maybe where?
The closest taco.
Okay. Just this is the rational thinker. It's like, okay, we ain't driving to New York City. There's no way to do that. There's not time. So we're just going to find a taco place and pull in there, and hopefully they're pretty good. And yet, one of the things our brain still does is, I'm going to be running around some, is that this part still may though go, yeah, but I'm going to remember. Maybe even this part of the brain says, I'm going to remember that place in New York because that was really good. And we're going to bookmark that. But I'm hoping that when I'm back in New York, we're going to find that street vendor and we're going to get some of these tacos and it's going to be awesome. And so we'll kind of keep that in our mind. But we've also, on this rational part of our brain, we just got to make decisions sometimes. It's like, yeah, that was really good, but no. Now, some of you live more in this part of your brain. Some of you actually live over here. You're going, well, let's see if GPS, how long would it take to drive to New York? Some of you really like to be more impulsive and to kind of live over here. But some of you, you really live over here and it's like, no, we got to really rationally think through everything before we make these decisions. And there can be a lot of differences between us as people as to where more we lean more towards one or the other, or maybe a really good split. But one of the points here is that if we've got a healthy working brain, we have the ability to do kind of all of this. That our brain, there's synthesis, it works together. The brain can communicate really well back and forth. And so there's this thing that keeps it going. There's also this thing that I don't really have anything for, but these two guys, since they have such different jobs, there's this thing called the corpus callosum that connects them. And so it's like a bridge or a telephone line, so they can talk to each other. And so periodically, they can, when they need to, actually all the time, they can communicate so that their different jobs don't make this brain way one-sided. One of the things that trauma does is it can start to really isolate the functions of the brain so that these guys don't talk much anymore. And you begin to find that one side may be much more than the other, or oftentimes that this part of the brain is the one that's running the show most of the time. And what happens then is when something really frightening happens or traumatic happens, or if you've had trauma in your history and something triggers it again, an example I love to use is somebody spent some time in the military and they saw some action and they had some gunfire or some explosions while they were there, created some trauma. And now they're back in the States and they're at a 4th of July celebration and maybe they're with a friend and the fireworks start to go off and the friend stands there going, oh wow, fireworks. But the other guy that was maybe in action in the military hits the ground. And it's not through this thinking part. It's just this part of the brain just goes, boom, we got to survive. Because that's what's happening. This part of the brain has gone in survival. So when the limbic part of the brain goes in survival, literally what happens is you grab the steering wheel. So kind of give it a little bit. She takes the steering wheel. You take control and you got this vehicle. You got both hands on this thing. You are driving. Yeah, you can hold the horn up there too. Give that horn a squeeze too. Just so, we let us know I'm in charge. And she now is. And when that happens, you guys grab this thing. And I want you just to be able to visualize this. These guys go offline. So pull that up. And they literally, this part of your brain goes offline, the prefrontal cortex. And she's the only one you got driving the bus right now. And I want you to see this picture to understand that then when you go, why did I react that way? Is because when the limbic brain's in charge, she's making all the decisions. And remember, this part of the brain doesn't have much to do with agreements that I've made, morality, anything else. This is about what's it going to take to survive, physically or emotionally. Any other way that feels like survival, this is about what have I got to do to survive. And then when the brain is able to kind of get grounded and come back into the rational brain, you guys can drop this again. They kind of come back online And they suddenly now can kind of think about this. So you take your steering wheel back. You like to have that. And then the left prefrontal cortex can now decide, did we make a good decision? So let me give you an example. Years ago, I remember seeing on, you may have seen on this scientific TV show, a TV show called America's Funniest Videos. And I remember one year they had, during the Halloween area, that this one they played over and over again, but this guy had put a video camera up on his front porch so that he could video kids coming up, and then he dressed up like a stuffed scarecrow made out of straw. That's what it looked like. And he was sitting on a chair on his front porch, and he was going to sit there really still, and as a kid came up to the front door, his idea was to jump, say boo, scare them, and then he would have all this on video later that he could laugh and watch. Well, what he didn't expect was an adult comes up on the front porch. The guy goes, boo, and the adult goes, ah, boom, hits him right in the face. And then he turns around and runs off the steps, like, ah. And then somewhere in the front yard, but first of all, what you see is fight or flight. Yeah. You see both of them. This part of the brain kicked in and goes, oh my gosh, 10-foot man-eating scarecrow, I'm dead, I've got to get out of here. But he punches first, runs. Now, that brain didn't think, okay, guys, let's have a committee meeting. What do we need to do right here? She took the steering wheel and she did what she's good at, is the limbic part of the brain survives. Then when the guy gets in the front yard off camera, probably what's going on is he goes, oh my gosh, there's no such thing as a real scarecrow that's alive. It was a person. And so he comes back up on the front porch going, I'm sorry, man, I'm sorry. Now you got this part of the brain taking over going, did I make a good decision? Some of us decide to go back and say, I'm sorry. And some of us may decide to just keep running because I don't want to face the music. But that's an example of how our brain works when things are scary, but it's still working normally. When trauma has occurred, which would be, like I said, something really frightening or a series of things that maybe you didn't think were frightening, but it still set in, and it gets stored in our brain as trauma, then what happens is anytime something seems similar, it triggers this brain. The brain is kind of going, oh no, here we go again. And so back she is in charge. A really quick example is, I remember hearing a story of a woman in the Nashville area that during broad daylight, and this was a couple of decades ago, but she got attacked in broad daylight in a parking lot. So it was really frightening for her. She went to see a therapist. They talked about it. He tried to help her. She felt like she was helped. She felt like things were good. And she said a couple of years later, she was walking across a parking lot at a university in Nashville to go into just a professional workshop. And as she was walking across the parking lot, a friend, a colleague who saw her, comes up behind her. It's okay if I grab your shoulders. He comes up and does this, goes, hi, and guess what she does? She throws her notebook, screams as she flips around and looks at him. For an instant, she does not see the eyes of her friend. She sees the original perpetrator of the crime, because this part of the brain is going, oh no, here we go again, because it feels similar. This part of the brain, if he had time to think, would go, no, that was then, this is a friend, but it doesn't have that much time because this part goes in really fast so that we can survive. It's doing its job. And then, as she first screams and drops her stuff, and this is all within an instant, he starts saying, it's just me, it's just me. And then you know what she tells herself? This is part of the damage we continue to do to ourselves after trauma, is then she started telling herself inside, you stupid idiot, why do you always overreact? What she's not understanding is that this part of her, once she made that judgment about herself, wasn't online when this part just went into survival mode. And when that happens, then we've got to understand what's taking place. And I have to wait till I'm grounded, I get back in my rational brain, so that then I can make good decisions. So part of what happens with trauma is then we have really got to do some healing around the trauma. It's really important. If this has happened for you, finding a therapist that knows trauma. There are a number of really good tools that can be used, but someone that works with trauma will have some of those tools. They'll know what works well for their clients. And to be able to move in, to be able to bring that down so that when this happens, steering wheel goes over here, this thing gets pulled up, and you guys are covered up, you're offline. The problem is that when you've had a trauma that really is sticking with you, or if you're living in an unsafe area, a person can live days, weeks, months in this position where this part of the brain is making most of the decisions. And that is not going to be a relational brain. We can't be in relationship very well and do relational things when this part is in charge, because she or he is going to be reacting. That part of our brain, the limbic part of the brain, is going to be reacting. So when we can do some of the healing work, we're actually helping to diminish the reaction that goes on in the brain. So you guys can put that back down now. You take back your rightful steering wheel.
Give me that.
Yeah. And then can make more of those decisions from this place. Again, years ago, I was just out of college, and I went to go get pizza at this restaurant. It was a brand new restaurant, and they were building a strip mall, but nothing else was there but this restaurant. And I was in there on a date. It was about 11 o'clock at night. The restaurant closes then. And these two men walk in the side door. I saw them walk in. They looked perfectly normal. So I didn't think anything about it. And as I'm sitting there with my date, I look up at her as I hear one of them say, "Come on, let's go." And I just thought he was talking to his friend because the restaurant's almost closing. And I look up at my date, and she is white as a sheet looking this way. And I'm going, of course, I turn and look. And there's a man standing there with a pistol pointed at us saying, "I said, come on, let's go." And it's weird what your brain can do in that moment. I remember my vision just kind of focused right in on the end of the barrel. And I remember thinking, for some reason, this is not a squirt gun. It's like, what in the world? So, of course, now I'm pretty terrified. He has us stand up, takes us back to the kitchen, has us all stand there while they rob the cash register, and they wind up leaving. But for years after that, I could be in a restaurant, especially if it was late at night, and if somebody walked in, even if it was almost out of my peripheral vision, I could pretty much tell you what those people were wearing. Because my brain is now going, what does this mean? What does this mean? And one of the helpless things that starts to happen when trauma has occurred is that our brain also, this part especially, can begin to say to us, wait a minute, as we're thinking about it later, I didn't see trouble coming the first time. I didn't recognize those two people were dangerous. How am I going to recognize it if it happens again? Because trouble again may not look like trouble. And so we begin to have this learned helplessness where we begin to realize, oh my gosh, I'm probably not going to recognize what I need to recognize. And so this part of the brain again becomes on red alert. And this part of the brain, this limbic part of the brain, is scanning kind of situations all the time going, is this okay? Is this safe? What does this mean? For children, oftentimes, this happens is that the child, if there's been, lots of yelling in the home, or they're going through a divorce, or anything that for the child feels scary, scary enough that they've gotten really worried and this part of the brain is active, then what a lot of times happens, the child will go, without meaning to, this part of the brain is scanning, looking, is this a big deal? Is this life-threatening? And then when the brain recognizes it's not life-threatening, for a lot of children, they'll be like, whew, I don't have to pay attention at all. And then wind up missing out on social cues, missing out learning things in school, missing out on a lot of things where even it begins to look like, and people think that maybe they have a learning disability. And so one of the things that happened for me is when I was going through school, for me there were some things that were frightening when I was growing up. And so my brain got a reaction too about like, oh gosh, is it safe? There were just some things that for me felt traumatic, at least my brain did. And so one example that I think is really important to share is in third grade. I'm sitting in third grade, and one day the teacher says to the class, okay, everybody pull out your blank piece of paper for the spelling test. And what my brain hears is, yeah, oh yeah, that's exactly how I reacted too. When the brain goes bang, because I didn't know we were having a spelling test. Now, for some of you, you may have experienced a situation like that. But for me, why that was really a scary moment is because in first and second grade, I had a lot of moments like that. There were these moments where I didn't understand why it seemed like a lot of people in the class knew something that was going on that I didn't know. Because in first and second grade and a lot of third grade, while the teacher is teaching, man, I am flying over treetops. I am daydreaming. I am having the best time daydreaming out until I would hear Bill from the teacher, and then it was like, oh, shoot, what are we doing? And I got to figure it out. So when the teacher says we're going to have a spelling test, and I don't know we're going to have one, even though I can already imagine the D that I'm going to probably make on the test and fearful about taking that grade home, but that's not what scares me the most. The thing that scares me the most is that when my parents are going to ask me, why did you make such a low grade, having to say, I didn't know we were having a test. Because that was so normal for me since I was, really what I was doing was dissociating in my daydreaming. Well, I just assumed that since I didn't know a lot of that stuff, I was stupid. Must be something wrong with me. And if something's wrong with me and I'm stupid, then my brain also figured out that, well, that probably won't get accepted and won't get loved as well. And so I learned to lie. I'd just say, oh, well, the reason I didn't do well was she asked the wrong words, or I studied the wrong words, or something was going on, or whatever it was, and I just come up with a reason so that at least I could save face a little bit. And then with the teacher, I tried to be funny, nice, something so that when I got the D on the paper, maybe she would give me a C- just because she liked me better. And that was my way of surviving. Some of those things were this part of the brain learning how to survive emotionally. Because as a third grader, this was a big deal for me. So for some of you, you may find that even in things like that don't seem like a big trauma, but there's something in there that's scaring you enough to go, I got to survive. I can't tell somebody the truth. I can't really say what's going on here. We figure out how to just survive in that setting. And then we grow up into an adult learning how to still survive, how to still not tell the truth, how to still hide whatever it is that I need to hide so that someone's not going to think badly of me or think I'm weak. And then what we wind up in is a world where we really aren't being truthful. And that can get us in trouble later. Another thing we know about trauma is that when you've experienced trauma, it increases your chances to have an addiction. Because the addiction is about trying to help you not feel all the fear that goes on with the trauma and when we get triggered. And so once again, there is this way of surviving, and so our brain figures out a way to not feel. Sometimes a person will say when they've been in an addiction, it wasn't so much about trying to find euphoria as they just wanted to try to feel normal. And so the use of the alcohol or the drugs or whatever it was just to try to chill and not feel this big threshold of anxiety that was taking place. And when they would feel that it's settling down and feeling normal, it was like, ah. And so when a person tells someone who's struggling with an addiction, if it was with alcohol, for instance, and they say, just stop drinking, the person who's struggling with the addiction may be going, are you crazy? You just want me to feel this stuff all the time? So what they'll do is you'll just go more underground and to go, sure, I'll be glad to stop. I can do that. And then they just keep sneaking more and more and more and finding their medicator so they don't have to feel this stuff. So also in the areas of addiction, if there has been trauma, we know we've got to do some healing with the trauma to be able to help the addiction not to just, otherwise we just stop with that addiction and we just find another one. Because we're bound and determined to survive and not have to feel this all the time. So in our relationships, in our communities, in our churches, in places where we are together with people, when we find that someone's doing something and they won't stop, but it's hurting them, or maybe it's maybe something that we don't understand why their reactions seem to be big, or sometimes a trauma, and if there's a long-term reactions to a trauma that's happened, and we often call it post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. If that has happened, then a lot of times that person may have these either big reactions, or sometimes it'll even be they'll be underreacting. Something big is happening and they'll just be like, they just sent them over the threshold, and so now they're just talking about information, but there's no emotional connection at all. And either of those can be a reaction from PTSD when we're just trying to, again, survive, and our brain is not online here, the thinking part. We're in the survival part. So if this has been your experience, we oftentimes will say, if something feels hysterical, if you go from 0 to 60 in your emotions in just no time, then we'll oftentimes say, if it feels hysterical, it's likely historical. You've likely just plugged into an old wound that's not been healed yet. And so when whatever it is that's happening now feels just like back then, and back then was huge, then suddenly you're feeling it again. And that's where a part of the healing needs to occur with trauma. We can't just tell people, you got to straighten up, or you need to depend on God more. Yes, depending upon God, of course, is amazingly important. However, this part of our brain that God made to help us survive is also actually functioning when we get triggered. It's actually functioning just the way it was meant to function. It's helping us survive. The problem is that when there has been a trauma occurred and it's stored in our brain, we keep getting triggered like a broken record to survive, even when something maybe we aren't in danger at the present moment. We need our brain to be able to step into the conflict or step into the situation and figure out what to do. So I want us to make sure that we encourage that if someone you know or someone you're in relationship with, or if this is you, that have experienced some trauma, that finding a therapist that knows trauma and understands it can really help do the healing, to bring down the intensity of the trigger, and then also help us to get grounded faster, quicker, get in our rational brain so that we can then make a better decision again. And that is a great place to be in our relationships. The last thing I want to say about it is a relationship, is that when your brain is getting triggered and suddenly you're in a triggered place, when you're in a relationship and in a marriage with someone else, you may be now reacting with things that your brain feels like, this is what I got to do or say to again, survive. And so out of your mouth may come angry statements that pushes the other person away, or blowing up, or these big responses, and later on we'll go, why do you do that over and over again? And then we may be like, God, I'm so sorry, I know it, I'm such an idiot, I can't believe I keep getting angry. But again, it may be that something's getting triggered that now feels like an emotional death, and this person's like, suddenly like, I feel like I'm going to be blamed again, it's all going to be my fault, and I'm used to feeling the shame, and I can't bear the shame anymore, and we just go into this reaction. And so even in relationships, it can cause some real difficulties where people get stuck wondering, why can't we just talk through this rationally? And if that's the case, it may be connected to trauma, where the person, again, that needs to get some healing around that trauma so that then when the relationship thing happens, you begin to go, oh, wait a minute. So one last story around that. I remember my wife and I, Laurie, she and I were starting to get into this argument. And as we were in this argument, during the argument, I'm literally believing that any moment she's going to hear me and she's going to finally say, oh, now I understand. I was wrong all along. You were right. Now, I don't know how many people have actually convinced someone that you were right and they were wrong. I don't think that happens very much. But for me, I was right in the middle of the argument, and she said something about, you just seem to take things and turn it around. And I just suddenly, my brain goes in the recesses of my memory, There have been other people that have said that to me, and literally my brain, this part I think probably was like, wait, is this possible that I've actually been making the big deal out of this and it's not my wife who's making the big deal of this? And there was like this big shift that happened, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm the one that's making the big deal and not her. And I was able to see this thing because when I was able to get back into my rational brain, I was able to realize, wow, I'm understanding this from a different perspective. But before then, it was really more about this limbic part of my brain of like, oh no, I'm going to be seen as at fault again. There's something here that's going to be my fault. And I just would go into this place of shame and just react out of that. And so a lot of my own personal healing really helped me to be able to get grounded faster, get out of that triggered place so that I could think through and then be able to realize, and then you can be relational. So I hope these things might spur you on a little bit to understand a little bit more about trauma, how we can treat people with trauma to be able to go, wait a minute, you seem kind of reactionary. Is something going on, rather than just preaching at them and telling them you got to stop, but also encouraging them to maybe get some help around some trauma that might be causing these reactions. And if so, man, we can do so much better in our ability to be relational, in our relationship with God, in our relationship with other people, and to be able to make a lot better decisions for ourselves. Thanks, and I hope this is helpful.